April 28th, 1945. The Bavarian roads are churning with mud, clogged by the debris of a dying empire. A column of exhausted infantrymen trudges west, their uniforms tattered, their eyes hollowed by weeks of relentless retreat. They are no longer looking for the enemy behind them, they are scanning the tree line ahead for their own officers. At a crossroads near the Austrian border, a checkpoint blocks the path. The men manning the barricade do not wear American olive drab or Soviet khaki. They wear the field grey of the Wehrmacht and the distinctive metal gorgets of the Feldgendarmerie. A shouted command pierces the morning mist. Papers are demanded. A hesitation. Then, the sharp, unmistakable crack of an MP-40 submachine gun. A German sergeant falls face down into the wet gravel, executed not by the invading Allies, but by his own countrymen for the crime of wanting to survive. In these final, frantic days, the Third Reich has turned its weapons inward, beginning a cannibalistic purge that will see thousands die at the hands of their brothers in arms. By the spring of 1945, the map of Europe, once stained entirely in the crimson of Nazi dominion, has shrunk to a thin, jagged corridor running through the heart of Germany. From the east, the Red Army is a steamroller of vengeance, pushing across the Oder River with millions of men and tens of thousands of tanks. From the west, the American and British armies have breached the Rhine, their armoured columns fanning out across the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr and driving deep into Bavaria. The Wehrmacht, once the most disciplined fighting force in history, is no longer a cohesive army. It is a collection of splintered battle groups, shattered divisions, and conscripted militias, all trapped in a shrinking cage. The reality on the ground is one of absolute disintegration. Communication lines are severed, fuel depots are dry. The Luftwaffe has effectively ceased to exist, leaving the roads entirely exposed to the relentless strafing of Allied fighter bombers. For the average German Lanzer, the strategic objective has shifted from victory to a far more primal goal: survival. The vast majority of German soldiers know the war is irretrievably lost. Their only hope is to disengage from the terrifying Eastern Front, where Soviet captivity promises almost certain death or decades of forced labour, and surrender to the Western Allies. This creates a massive, westward migration of military personnel, a chaotic retreat that looks less like a manoeuvre and more like a desperate flight. However, in the damp, claustrophobic gloom of the Führer bunker in Berlin, a different reality is being enforced. Adolf Hitler, his health failing and his tremors visible, has divorced himself from the suffering of his people. On March 19, 1945, he issues the Demolitions on Reich Territory Decree, historically known as the Nero Decree. It is an order of nihilistic spite. It commands that all military transport, communication, industrial and supply facilities, anything of value within Reich territory, must be destroyed. Nothing is to be left for the enemy, not even the infrastructure necessary for the German people's post-war survival. When Armaments Minister Albert Speer protests, arguing that the German people need electricity and water to survive, Hitler's response is chillingly absolute. If the war is lost, the nation will also perish. In the eyes of the High Command, the German people have failed their leader, and therefore do not deserve to survive him. This ideology filters down through the ranks of the party fanatics. Surrender is not viewed as a military necessity, but as a biological betrayal. This disconnection between the leadership and the soldier on the ground creates a lethal friction. The High Command demands that every town be turned into a fortress, every bridge be defended to the last man, and every soldier fight until the final round. Field marshals like Walter Model and Albert Kesselring issue orders threatening immediate death to anyone who retreats without written authorization. Yet, the officers on the front line can see the absurdity of these orders. They look at their platoons, often composed of wounded veterans, 16-year-old Hitler Youth, and old men from the Volkssturm, and they know that holding a position against a Sherman tank platoon is suicide. The German military structure begins to fracture along ideological lines. On one side are the pragmatists, professional Wehrmacht officers who want to save the lives of their men and the infrastructure of their country. They falsify reports, sabotage demolition charges on bridges, and quietly order their units to melt away into the forests. On the other side are the Endsieg believers, the Waffen-SS, the political officers, and the die-hard Nazis who view any step backward as treason. They believe that secret weapons or a sudden rupture in the Allied alliance will save the Reich at the 11th hour. The tension is palpable in every village and crossroads. A unit attempting to retreat might be hailed as saviors by the local civilians who want to avoid their town becoming a battlefield, only to be ambushed by a passing SS column that views them as deserters. The distinctions between friend and foe blur. The uniform alone is no longer a guarantee of safety. As the physical territory of the Reich collapses, the psychological territory becomes a paranoid nightmare where loyalty is measured in blood. The stage is set for a war within a war, where the machinery of the state turns against its own cogs to force the gears to keep turning even as the engine burns out. To enforce obedience in this crumbling landscape, the Nazi regime unleashes a terror apparatus that is unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. As the front lines dissolve, the rear areas become the hunting ground for the Feldgendarmerie, the military police. Known grimly by the regular soldiers as Kettenhunde, or chain dogs, because of the crescent-shaped metal gorget suspended by a chain around their necks, these units act as the enforcers of the will to resist. In the early years of the war, their job was traffic control and prisoner management. Now, in 1945, they are execution squads roving the countryside with a single mandate: stem the tide of retreat with bullets. The legal instrument empowering this terror is the Fliegendes Standgericht, the flying court-martial. On February 15, 1945, a new decree is issued by the Reich Minister of Justice, Otto Thierack, authorized by Hitler. It strips away the final remnants of due process for German soldiers. These mobile tribunals, often consisting of nothing more than an SS officer, a fanatical Nazi Party official, and a Wehrmacht representative, travel in armored cars and trucks behind the lines. They have the authority to try, convict, and execute any soldier or civilian deemed to be undermining the defensive strength of the nation. There are no appeals. There is no defense counsel. The trial often lasts less than 5 minutes. The definition of defeatism is expanded to include almost any rational behavior. A soldier found without his unit is a deserter. A soldier found with disordered attire is a defeatist. A unit retreating from an overrun position is accused of cowardice. The punishment is invariably death, usually by hanging from the nearest tree or lamppost, with a placard placed around the victim's neck reading, "I hang here because I betrayed my Führer," or "I am a coward who abandoned his comrades." These swaying bodies become a common sight along the roads of Bavaria and Berlin, grim signposts intended to terrify the living into continued resistance. General Ferdinand Schörner, commanding Army Group Center, becomes the personification of this ruthless discipline. Known as Bloody Ferdinand, he is a favorite of Hitler for his brutality. Schörner issues orders that are draconian even by Nazi standards. He famously decrees that any soldier found behind the front line without written orders is to be shot immediately. He backs this up by stripping the rank pips from officers who retreat, sending them into penal battalions, or simply having them shot by their own men. Under Schörner's command, the fear of the general behind the lines becomes greater than the fear of the Russians in front. Crucially, this internal war is fueled by the breakdown of the chain of command. With telephone lines down and radio frequencies jammed, local commanders are left operating in a vacuum. A lieutenant in a remote village might decide to surrender his platoon to save the town from destruction. But if a wandering SS unit arrives an hour later, that lieutenant is not seen as a tactical commander making a difficult choice. He is seen as a traitor. The SS, operating under the direct authority of Heinrich Himmler, increasingly views the regular Wehrmacht with suspicion. They begin to set up their own checkpoints, independent of the military police, creating a chaotic web of jurisdiction where a soldier can be cleared by one authority and executed by the next. This atmosphere of paranoia infects the civilian population as well. The Blockleiter, or block warden, and local party officials are ordered to mobilize the Volkssturm, the people's militia. Old men and young boys are handed Panzerfausts and told to stop tanks. If they refuse, or if they discard their weapons and go home, they face the same flying courts-martial as the soldiers. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant vanishes. A farmer hiding a deserting son in his barn is liable to be shot alongside him. By April 1945, the Third Reich is no longer fighting a war for territory. It is fighting a war against its own collapse. The internal front has become as deadly as the external one. German soldiers must now navigate a lethal gauntlet. To the west, the overwhelming firepower of the Americans. To the east, the terrifying wrath of the Soviets. And to the rear, the cold, fanatical eyes of the chain dogs, searching for any sign of weakness. It is in this cauldron of suspicion and fear that the unity of the German military finally snaps, leading to open combat between different factions of the same armed forces. The disintegration of the German war machine is not a uniform collapse. It is a violent fracture along the fault lines of ideology. At the center of this fracture lies the deep-seated, often lethal animosity between the regular Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. For years, this rivalry was suppressed by the momentum of victory, but in defeat, it erupts into open hostility. To the average Wehrmacht conscript, the grenadier freezing in a foxhole with 5 rounds of ammunition left, the SS units passing through his sector are no longer elite comrades. They are dangerous zealots whose presence invites catastrophe. Wehrmacht commanders know, but if an SS unit sets up positions in a village, they will fight with a recklessness that guarantees the village's total destruction by Allied artillery. Once the SS retreat or die, the Wehrmacht is left to deal with the rubble and the vengeance of the enemy. Consequently, regular army officers begin to quietly coordinate their movements to avoid the SS entirely, treating them almost as a third belligerent force. The distrust is mutual. The Waffen-SS, indoctrinated in the belief that will alone triumphs over matter, views the exhausted Wehrmacht as defeated defeatists. SS officers, often younger and more fanatical than their army counterparts, begin commandeering supplies from Wehrmacht depots at gunpoint. They confiscate fuel trucks intended for ambulances to power their Tiger tanks. In several documented instances along the Elbe River, SS patrols set up roadblocks specifically to intercept retreating Wehrmacht units, stripping the soldiers of their weapons and forcing them back to the front under threat of immediate execution. It is a cannibalization of resources, where the political soldiers steal the means of survival from the professional soldiers. This internal paranoia is amplified by the Nazi regime's launch of Operation Werwolf. Propaganda Minister Josef Goebbels takes to the airwaves, calling for a partisan uprising behind Allied lines. He urges the German population to harass the enemy, block his path, and ambush him. The Werwolf radio broadcasts scream a terrifying warning. Hatred is our prayer, revenge is our battle cry. While the actual military impact of the werewolf movement is negligible against the Allied armies, its psychological impact on the German people is devastating. Goebbels explicitly threatens that any German who collaborates with the Allies, by accepting a position as a mayor, by repairing power lines, or even by hanging a white sheet from a window, will be judged by a Wehrmacht court and liquidated. This is not an empty threat. The most chilling example occurs in the city of Aachen, the first major German city to fall to the Americans. The Allies appoint a respected local lawyer, Franz Oppenhoff, as the new mayor to restore order and utilities. Berlin reacts with fury. Himmler orders Oppenhoff's assassination. A team of SS and Luftwaffe agents parachutes behind American lines in a daring, suicidal mission called Operation Carnival. On Palm Sunday, March 25, 1945, they infiltrate Aachen. Two of the assassins knock on Oppenhoff's door. When the mayor opens it, they gun him down on his own steps. The murder of Franz Oppenhoff sends a shockwave through the crumbling Reich. It sends a clear message to every burgermeister, police chief, and officer considering surrender. The regime has long arms, and it will kill you even after the Americans have arrived. This act of terror freezes many local officials into inaction. They are caught in a deadly paralysis, terrified of the Allied bombs falling on their heads, but even more terrified of the werewolf assassin hiding in the shadows. It forces moderate Germans to keep fighting, not out of loyalty to Hitler, but out of a desperate need to avoid being murdered by his last disciples. The war against the internal enemy reaches its most tragic pitch with the mobilization of the Volkssturm. By decree, every male between the ages of 16 and 60, not already serving, is conscripted. These units are tragic parodies of an army. Grandfathers in World War I greatcoats and teenage boys in oversized helmets, armed with a single Panzerfaust or a captured Italian rifle. Their military utility is negligible, but their political utility is immense. They are human sandbags meant to delay the inevitable. When these makeshift units inevitably break under fire, the retribution is swift. In towns across Germany, trees are festooned with the bodies of old men and teenagers, hanged by roving SS squads as a warning to others. But the violence is not just top-down, it becomes a civil war on the village level. In the Bavarian mining town of Penzberg, a horrific event known as the Penzberg Murder Night unfolds on April 28, 1945. Hearing a radio broadcast that the war is effectively over, the local citizens, led by the former Social Democrat mayor Hans Rummer, peacefully depose the Nazi mayor to prevent the Wehrmacht from blowing up the local coal mine, the town's only economic future. They want to surrender the town intact to the Americans, but the local Wehrmacht commander refuses to accept this betrayal. He alerts a nearby werewolf unit. That evening, roughly 100 fanatic soldiers storm the town. They arrest Rummer and 15 other citizens. There is no trial. Under the cover of darkness, the werewolf unit hangs 7 people from the trees in the town center and shoots the others in the relentless rain. They pin signs to the bodies of the women and men. Werwolf. Warning. Traitors die. This happens just 2 days before the Americans liberate the town. It is a microcosm of the national suicide. Neighbors murdering neighbors over a war that has already been decided, driven by a nihilistic refusal to let the future begin. This psychology of Endphasenverbrechen, or end-phase crimes, is driven by a toxic mixture of fanaticism and fatalism. For the true believers, Survival in a post-Nazi world is inconceivable. They operate on a scorched earth policy of the soul. If the Reich falls, they believe the German people have forfeited their right to exist. Therefore, accelerating the destruction is not a crime. It is a punishment inflicted on a failed nation. Conversely, for the regular Wehrmacht soldiers witnessing this madness, a final psychological break occurs. The bond of loyalty to the leadership is severed by the sight of German bodies swinging from German lampposts. The brotherhood of arms dissolves. Officers who have fought for 6 years suddenly realize that their most dangerous enemy is no longer the tank division across the valley, but the political officer sleeping in the next room. This rupture sets the stage for the strangest battle of the entire war. Deep in the Austrian Tyrol, near the village of Itter, sits a medieval castle converted into a VIP prison. It holds the highest value hostages of the Reich: former French Prime Ministers Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, Generals Weygand and Gamelin, and tennis star Jean Barotra. As the SS Totenkopf division approaches with orders to execute these prisoners before the Allies arrive, the traditional lines of loyalty are about to be completely erased. Here, the internal German war will stop being a series of executions and turn into a full-scale, open battle between the Wehrmacht and the SS. May 4, 1945. The Tyrol region of Austria. A landscape of breathtaking alpine beauty stands in stark contrast to the ugliness of the collapsing Reich. Perched on a hill overlooking the Brixental Valley sits Schloss Itter, Castle Itter. A formidable medieval fortress with thick stone walls and a commanding view of the winding roads below, it looks like something out of a fairy tale. But inside, it is a high-stakes prison. The guests of this castle are the elite of pre-war France, former Prime Ministers Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, General Maxime Weygand, Commander-in-Chief Maurice Gamelin, and the tennis legend Jean Barotra. For years they have been held here as bargaining chips, but now, with Hitler dead and the Reich dissolving, their value as hostages has evaporated. They have become liabilities. The commander of the prison, Sebastian Wimmer, flees in the night, fearing the wrath of the approaching Allies. But the prisoners are not free. They are trapped. The surrounding hills are crawling with units from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen. These are not reluctant conscripts. They are battle-hardened fanatics who have received orders to leave no witnesses. The French VIPs arm themselves with weapons left behind by the fleeing guards, but they are politicians and old generals, not infantrymen. They look out from the ramparts and see the SS tightening the noose. They need a miracle. That miracle comes in the form of Wehrmacht Major Josef Gangl. Gangl is a decorated officer who has seen the horrors of the Eastern Front and the retreat from Normandy. By May 1945, he has had enough. He has quietly made contact with the local Austrian resistance, supplying them with weapons and protecting local civilians from SS reprisals. When a desperate messenger from the castle reaches him, begging for help, Gangl faces a choice that defines the absurdity of the war's final days. He has only 20 soldiers under his command. If he marches on the castle, the SS regiment in the hills will slaughter them. He needs heavy armor. He needs firepower. He needs the Americans. In a scene that defies all military logic, Major Gangl climbs into his Kubelwagen, raises a massive white flag, and drives full speed toward the American lines. He is driving directly into the path of the US 12th Armored Division. Near the town of Kufstein, he encounters an American reconnaissance unit led by Captain John Jack Lee, a cigar-chomping, pragmatic tank commander. Gangl steps out of his vehicle, hands raised, but not to surrender. Through a translator, he explains the situation: the French VIPs, the SS death squads, and the castle. He effectively asks the American captain to join him in a rescue mission. Captain Lee looks at the German officer, looks at the map, and makes a decision that has no precedent in the US Army field manual. He agrees. The resulting convoy is a sight of utter surrealism. Leading the column is Captain Lee's Sherman tank, christened Besotten Jenny. Behind it rattles Major Gangl's Kubelwagen and a Wehrmacht truck carrying German Wehrmacht soldiers. Sitting on the back of the tank, American GIs pass cigarettes to German grenadiers. They are united by a common enemy, the Waffen-SS. As they wind their way up the narrow, twisting road toward Castle Itter, the reality of their situation sets in. They are a tiny, mixed force, less than 30 men and one tank, driving into a stronghold surrounded by hundreds of SS troops. As they cross the bridge leading to the castle gate, the SS in the woods open fire. Bullets ping off the Sherman's hull. The Besotten Jenny roars across the bridge, smashing through the gate and positioning itself in the main courtyard. The gate slams shut behind them. The trap is set. Inside the castle, the French prisoners stare in disbelief as American and German soldiers spill out of the vehicles and immediately begin setting up defensive positions together. Gangl's men take the north wall. Lee's men take the gatehouse. For the first and only time in the war, the Wehrmacht and the US Army are fighting shoulder to shoulder as allies. But as night falls, the SS begin to probe the defenses. Flares burst overhead, illuminating the grey uniforms moving through the tree line. The siege of Castle Itter has begun. Dawn breaks over the Tyrol on May 5, 1945. The mist clinging to the valley floor begins to lift, revealing the lethal reality of the situation. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division has used the night to position 88mm anti-aircraft guns and heavy machine guns on the surrounding slopes. They have the high ground, the numbers, and the heavy weaponry. Inside the castle, the defenders, an impossible coalition of Americans, Wehrmacht regulars, and Austrian resistance fighters, check their ammunition. They know help is coming, but they also know the SS are preparing for a final liquidation. At 10 a.m., silence is shattered. The SS 88mm gun barks from the tree line. The first shell screams across the valley and slams directly into the Besotten Jenny. The Sherman tank, parked in the main gate as a mobile pillbox, shudders violently. A second shell hits moments later. The tank erupts into flames, forcing the radio operator to bail out. The defenders have lost their only heavy weapon. The castle is now naked against the assault. Sensing blood, the SS infantry launch their attack. They swarm up the steep slopes, moving cover to cover, firing MP40s and Kar 98Ks at the battlements. On the walls, the scene is chaotic. American GIs are firing their M1 Garands alongside Wehrmacht soldiers firing Mausers. Major Gangl and Captain Lee run stooped along the ramparts, shouting orders in 2 languages, directing fire at the grey shapes moving through the brush. Even the French VIPs join the fray. 72-year-old Paul Renault grabs a machine gun, gritting his teeth as the recoil shakes his frame, firing down at the men who were once his captors. The pressure intensifies. The SS breach the outer perimeter. Bullets chip away the stone masonry, showering the defenders in dust and shrapnel. The telephone lines are cut. The radio in the burning tank is dead. They are completely cut off. Then, tragedy strikes the heart of the defense. Major Gangl spots former Prime Minister Renault standing dangerously exposed in the courtyard, firing wildly. Gangl sprints from his cover, grabbing the old politician to pull him out of the line of fire. In that split second of movement, a sniper's bullet catches Gangl in the head. He collapses instantly, dying on the cobblestones of the castle he came to liberate. He is the only defender to fall, a German officer killed by a German bullet while saving a French leader from German troops. By early afternoon, ammunition is critically low. The SS are preparing to blow the main gate with Panzerfausts. Captain Lee pulls his men back into the keep, the massive central tower. They prepare for hand-to-hand combat in the stairwells. The end seems inevitable. Suddenly, a low rumble echoes through the valley, distinct from the sharp crack of tank fire. It is the deep, throaty roar of engines. Then, the sound of heavy machine guns tearing through the woods from the rear. The defenders look out from the arrow slits. Rolling up the road is a column of American tanks and half-tracks from the 142nd Infantry Regiment. They have broken through the SS roadblock. The American relief force opens up with everything they have. 50 caliber rounds shred the SS positions in the tree line. The SS, caught between the castle walls and the fresh American armor, shatter. They break contact and flee into the dense alpine forests. The siege is broken. As the first American jeep rolls into the smoke-filled courtyard, the exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers drop their rifles, not in surrender, but in relief. The battle is over. The smoke clears over Castle Itter, revealing the strange tableau of the battle's end. American medics move among the wounded, treating Wehrmacht soldiers and GIs side by side. The body of Major Josef Gangl is reverently lifted from the cobblestones. He is later honored as a hero of the Austrian resistance, a street in the nearby town of Würgl eventually named after him, a rare distinction for a Wehrmacht officer in the post-war world. For the French VIPs, the ordeal is over. They are whisked away to Paris to resume their political lives, their survival a footnote in the chaotic final chapter of the war. But for the Wehrmacht soldiers who fought alongside the Americans, there is no ticker-tape parade. As the adrenaline fades, the geopolitical reality returns. They are disarmed, marched into holding pens, and processed as prisoners of war. They fought against the SS, yes, but they still wear the uniform of the enemy. It is a bitter, confusing end to their service, emblematic of the muddied morality of 1945. Beyond the stone walls of Itter, however, the internal purge of the German military has left a far grimmer legacy. As the Allied armies conduct their final sweeps of the German countryside in May and June, they stumble upon the harvest of the flying courts-martial. In roadside ditches, in village squares, and hanging from the girders of destroyed bridges, they find thousands of German bodies. These are not combat casualties. They are the victims of their own leadership. Historians estimate that in the final months of the war, the Nazi regime executed between 20,000 and 30,000 of its own soldiers for desertion or defeatism. To put this into perspective, during the entire First World War, the German army executed fewer than 50 of its own men. The British army executed around 300. The scale of the 1945 purge is industrial. It is a massacre of the disillusioned by the fanatical. The reports filed by Allied units are chillingly repetitive. The US 42nd Infantry Division reports finding a bridge near Donauwörth where 3 teenage boys, conscripted into the SS but attempting to flee home to their mothers, hang with signs around their necks. I was too cowardly to fight for my people. In Berlin, as the Soviets stormed the Reichstag, SS squads roam the subway tunnels, hanging civilians who refuse to help build barricades. It is a frenzy of self-cannibalization that continues until the very hour of surrender. The psychological toll on the survivors is immense. The comradeship of the front, that sacred bond that supposedly held the German army together, is revealed to be a lie. In the end, it wasn't the enemy who pulled the trigger on the man in the foxhole next to you. It was the Feldgendarmerie patrol. This betrayal sows a deep, silent trauma that will fester in the German consciousness for decades. The soldiers who return home do not just carry the guilt of what they did to others, but the terror of what was done to them by their own state. The guns fall silent, but the legal and moral reckoning for this internecine slaughter proves far more difficult to resolve. In the immediate post-war years, the clean Wehrmacht myth begins to take hold. The idea that the regular army fought honorably, while only the SS committed crimes. But the reality of the final purge complicates this narrative. Wehrmacht officers were not just victims of the system. Many were enthusiastic participants. General Ferdinand Schörner, the architect of the most brutal disciplinary measures, is eventually captured by the Americans, handed over to the Soviets, and later imprisoned in West Germany. Yet, he remains unrepentant to his dying day, insisting that his terror campaign was necessary to maintain order. More disturbing is the fate of the judges and officers who staffed the flying courts-martial. In the chaotic denazification hearings of the 1950s, many of these men argue that they were simply applying the military law of the time. Because the Third Reich had legalized these summary executions through official decrees, the perpetrators often escape justice. They return to civilian life, becoming lawyers, judges, and civil servants in the New Germany, walking the same streets as the families of the soldiers they hanged. The strategic consequence of this internal war is ultimately zero. The execution of 20,000 German soldiers did not stop the Red Army for a single hour. The hanging of the mayor of Penzberg did not prevent the Americans from taking the town. The fanaticism of the final days achieved nothing but a higher body count. It reveals the ultimate hollowness of the Nazi ideology. Stripped of its conquests and its pageantry, it had nothing left to offer its own people but death. The Endkampf leaves a scar on the German military psyche that never fully heals. It destroys the Prussian ideal of the officer as a father to his men. It replaces loyalty with fear. And as the years pass, the stories of Itter, of Penzberg, and of the lonely roadside executions serve as a grim reminder that, in a totalitarian state, the final enemy is always the citizen. The war in Europe ends not with a grand final battle, but with a signature on a piece of paper in a schoolhouse in Reims. The guns fall silent. The checkpoints are dismantled. But for the thousands of German soldiers buried in unmarked graves behind their own lines, the silence comes too late. The internal war of 1945 reveals a terrifying truth about the nature of totalitarianism. A regime built on the concept of absolute power cannot accept the reality of absolute defeat. When the external enemy becomes too strong to defeat, the ideology turns inward, searching for scapegoats to feed the machinery of violence. The traitor becomes a necessary invention to explain why the master race is losing. For centuries, the military contract was simple. The soldier offers his life for the state, and in return, the state offers him purpose and protection. In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich tore that contract to shreds. It demanded loyalty unto death, while offering nothing but the hangman's noose in return. The soldiers who fought at Castle Itter, turning their guns on the SS to save their former enemies, were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting to reclaim their humanity from a system that had long since abandoned it. History often remembers World War II as a clash between nations, democracy against fascism, East against West. But the final chapter was a civil war of the soul. It was a struggle between the fanaticism that demanded the world burn and the basic human instinct to let the fire go out. In the end, the German soldier's last enemy was not the American tank commander or the Soviet rifleman. It was the officer standing behind him, holding the pistol.